The Coleman family murders, faith, fraud, and a house of lies. On the morning of May 5, 2009, a quiet subdivision in Columbia, Illinois, was interrupted by flashing lights. Police cruisers lined the street. Neighbors stood in clusters at the edge of manicured lawns. Yellow tape stretched across the entrance to a home that just hours earlier had looked like any other. Inside, 3 bodies were found: a mother, 2 young boys, strangled in their beds. The father had called 911. His voice was urgent, controlled, but shaken. He said he had returned home from the gym and found his family unresponsive. Their names were Sherry Coleman and her sons Garrett Coleman and Gavin Coleman. Sherry was 31, Garrett was 11, Gavin was 9. The father, Christopher Coleman, told officers that threats had been made against the family. He insisted someone had targeted them. And in the house, investigators found something unusual. On the walls, written in red paint, were threatening messages. The words suggested religious hatred, references to faith, warnings that "you have paid." It appeared staged to look like an extremist attack. But even in the earliest hours, something felt off. The home showed no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no pried doors, no clear disturbance consistent with a stranger moving violently through the house. Sherry and the boys were strangled with ligatures. There were no defensive wounds suggesting prolonged struggle. It looked controlled, deliberate, intimate. Christopher Coleman was not an unemployed drifter. He had worked as a bodyguard and security director for a prominent televangelist. His life revolved around public faith and protection. He was accustomed to discussing threats. He told investigators the family had received disturbing emails weeks prior, messages warning of danger, messages referencing religion. He claimed he had reported these threats. Neighbors recalled seeing police presence at the home days earlier. It seemed credible. But staged scenes often lean heavily into narrative, and narrative can unravel under scrutiny. In the days leading up to the murders, Christopher Coleman had been involved in an extramarital affair. Investigators would later uncover hundreds of messages exchanged with another woman. Messages discussing divorce, messages describing a desire to start over, messages that hinted at dissatisfaction with his marriage. But at first, however, the community believed they were witnessing a targeted hate crime. The red writing on the walls was visceral. It demanded interpretation. But the timeline raised questions. Christopher said he left for the gym around 5 a.m. He returned around 6 a.m. That window, 1 hour, was the alleged time of the attack. Yet no neighbors reported suspicious vehicles, no strangers seen entering or exiting. The subdivision was not isolated farmland. It was residential, close-knit. Even early morning activity tends to be noticed. Investigators examined Christopher's behavior. He appeared composed. He gave interviews. He spoke about faith, about protection, about loss. But composure does not equate to innocence, and grief manifests differently in different people. The crime scene writing became central. Handwriting analysis was conducted, forensic examination of paint strokes. The red substance was not blood, it was paint from inside the home. The messages were written on interior walls, not scrawled in haste, but applied in strokes that seemed measured. A stranger committing triple homicide and then calmly staging religious messages inside the house would require time. Yet the estimated time of death aligned closely with Christopher's morning absence. No alarm system had been triggered. No security camera footage revealed intrusion. The garage door had not been forced. If an intruder entered, it was through an unlocked access point, or with a key. The boys were found in separate bedrooms, Sherry in another. The killer moved room to room. Strangulation requires proximity, hands on cord, pressure maintained. It is not distant violence, it is personal. Late at night, when this story is told slowly, the tension lies in contradiction. A father who reports threats, a staged hate message, no forced entry, a narrow timeline, and an affair unfolding quietly in parallel. Christopher Coleman's communications with his mistress would later become critical. In text messages, he described marital dissatisfaction, spoke of wanting freedom, mentioned life without financial burden. Life insurance policies on Sherry added another layer, substantial sums, enough to reset a life. But in the early hours of May 5th, none of that was publicly known. All the public saw was a father on the front lawn, 3 bodies inside, red words on walls, faith invoked as motive, and a town shaken. In the hours after the murders in Colombia, investigators did what experienced homicide detectives always do. They worked backward. The walls bore red messages meant to signal religious extremism, threatening phrases, references to punishment. But staged scenes often lean heavily into explanation, and explanation invites scrutiny. The first major question, entry. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken locks, no shattered glass, no pried doors. The Coleman home was not left open overnight, and according to neighbors, nothing unusual had been seen in the early morning hours of May 5th. If an intruder entered, he either had access or moved invisibly. The second question, timeline. Christopher Coleman told police he left for the gym around 5 a.m. Surveillance footage later confirmed his presence at a gym in a neighboring town. But footage timestamps became critical. Security cameras showed him arriving later than he initially reported and leaving earlier than expected. The gap narrowed. Digital breadcrumbs matter. Phone records showed that Christopher had sent a text message shortly after leaving the house, a routine message. But forensic analysis would later suggest that his phone activity during the morning contradicted portions of his initial statement. Investigators also examined the threatening emails he claimed to have received weeks earlier. These emails referenced violence, religious anger, warnings of harm. They had been sent from anonymous accounts. But when forensic specialists traced IP addresses and account creation data, something emerged. The emails were linked back to computers associated with Christopher. The narrative began to shift. The threats may not have been from an external extremist. They may have originated inside the marriage. At the same time, detectives uncovered the affair. Hundreds of messages exchanged between Christopher and another woman. Intimate messages, future-oriented messages, discussions of divorce, financial constraints. One message described wanting a fresh start. Another referenced life insurance. Life insurance policies on Cherie Coleman totaled substantial amounts. Combined with child policies, the potential payout exceeded $1 million. Money is not always motive, but motive rarely ignores money. The digital evidence became increasingly difficult to dismiss. Christopher had searched for ways to create anonymous email accounts. He had sent messages to himself, posing as threats. He had reported those threats to local police prior to the murders. This established a paper trail, a preemptive explanation. If harm came to the family, it would appear externally motivated. But the writing on the walls complicated that illusion. Forensic analysis showed the red paint used in the messages came from inside the home, a container stored in the garage. The brush strokes were steady, deliberate. There were no fingerprints from unknown intruders, no foreign DNA, only the absence of struggle. The strangulation method itself is revealing. Strangulation is quiet. It leaves minimal external noise, but it requires proximity and sustained pressure. The boys were found in their beds. There was no sign they had left their rooms, no overturned furniture, no defensive wounds suggesting prolonged fight. Cherie was found in another bedroom, also strangled. No signs of forced sexual assault, no evidence of ransacking. The house remained orderly. The killer moved calmly from room to room. Late at night, when this story is told slowly, the emotional center tightens around intimacy. Strangulation is not distance. It is hands or cord near skin. It is seconds stretching into minutes. It is looking at someone while they lose consciousness. That requires emotional detachment or resolve. Investigators reconstructed Christopher's movements on May 5th, minute by minute. Phone records, gym entry logs, surveillance footage, vehicle data. The more they aligned the timestamps, the less room there was for an unknown intruder. The alleged hate threats began to look like scaffolding, a narrative built in advance, a story constructed to survive initial questioning. But stories fracture under forensic light. When confronted with inconsistencies, Christopher maintained innocence. He insisted someone had targeted his faith, that the threats were real, that an intruder had entered. But without forced entry, without unknown DNA, without witness sightings, the theory weakened. The affair intensified suspicion. In messages to his mistress, he described dissatisfaction with his marriage, spoke of stress, financial concerns, and a desire for a different life. Divorce would have been costly, public scandal damaging. Life insurance offered liquidity and sympathy. Family annihilation cases often follow similar arcs. The perpetrator seeks escape from responsibility. Financial pressure compounds emotional dissatisfaction. Rather than separate, they eliminate and stage. By late 2009, investigators had enough to charge Christopher Coleman with the murders of Cherie and his sons. The staged hate crime theory collapsed under forensic light. The emails he claimed were threats had originated from accounts he created. The IP traces linked back. The timeline aligned too tightly. The gym alibi narrowed. The house showed no sign of external intrusion. The red writing became less a warning and more a performance. As investigators built their case against Christopher Coleman, the pattern that emerged was not chaotic. It was structured. And structure is often more disturbing than rage. Family annihilation cases rarely erupt without warning signs. There were usually stress fractures beneath the surface, financial strain, marital dissatisfaction, extramarital attachment, reputation risk. Christopher's life had begun to split into two narratives. Publicly, he was a husband, father, and security professional tied to a prominent religious ministry. Privately, he was deeply involved in an affair. Text messages between him and his mistress revealed increasing emotional distance from his marriage. He described his wife, Cherie Coleman, as controlling in some exchanges. He spoke of wanting out, of starting over. But divorce is expensive, especially with children, and in his case, public image mattered. A high-profile separation could damage professional standing. Life insurance, however, provided a different path. Policies covering Cherie and the boys were active, substantial payouts, enough to erase debt, enough to build a new life. Investigators uncovered evidence that Christopher had searched online for ways to make emails appear anonymous. He had created accounts from devices linked to him. The threatening messages, framed as religious hate, were sent from those accounts. He had then reported those threats to law enforcement weeks before the murders. That act is critical because it shows pre-staging. He planted the seed of external danger. He established the narrative before the crime occurred. When family annihilators stage scenes, they often over-explain. They want investigators to see motive immediately. But authentic hate crimes typically include chaos, forced entry, graffiti applied in haste, external damage. In the Coleman home, the writing appeared deliberate, the brushstrokes controlled. The paint came from inside the garage. There were no foreign footprints, no broken locks. The digital evidence became the backbone of the prosecution. Phone pings, computer logs, IP address tracking, gym surveillance timestamps. The timeline narrowed around the early morning hours. Christopher left for the gym, but the window between estimated time of death and his verified location grew uncomfortably tight. Strangulation leaves physical markers, petechial hemorrhaging, ligature impressions. Autopsies confirmed that Cherie and the boys had been strangled manually or with ligatures. The boys were attacked in separate rooms. There was no evidence of prolonged struggle, which suggests surprise, sleep, or trust. Late at night, when this story is told slowly, the hardest element to confront is proximity. Strangling a stranger during a robbery is horrific. Strangling your children requires something colder. It requires calculation that overrides instinct. Investigators also reviewed Christopher's behavior immediately after the murders. His 911 call was urgent but controlled. He emphasized the threatening messages, directed attention toward an external extremist narrative. He mentioned prior police involvement due to threats. It sounded rehearsed. As the investigation tightened, Christopher maintained innocence. He denied writing the emails, denied staging the scene, denied harming his family. But digital forensics does not rely on emotion. It relies on trace. IP logs tied the threatening emails to devices in his possession. Search histories aligned with planning. Affair communications revealed motive. Financial records showed potential gain. The mask began to slip. Community reaction shifted from sympathy to disbelief. Neighbors who had stood beside him during the initial shock reevaluated memories. Friends questioned conversations from weeks earlier. Faith community members struggled to reconcile the man they knew with the charges filed. Family annihilation often carries a secondary shockwave. The idea that the protector is the perpetrator destabilizes trust more deeply than external crime, because it suggests danger from within. The prosecution would eventually argue that Christopher chose annihilation over divorce, that he preferred sympathy over scandal, that he staged hate to misdirect. The defense maintained that evidence was circumstantial, that digital traces could be misinterpreted, but as the layers accumulated, the picture hardened. This was not a random extremist attack. It was a controlled internal act. The red writing on the walls became symbolic not of hate crime, but of calculated deception. The house in Colombia returned to quiet, but it was not the quiet of peace. It was the quiet of absence. 3 bedrooms empty,
a yard unchanged, neighbors passing by with a different understanding of what had occurred inside. When the trial of Christopher Coleman began, the narrative the prosecution presented was simple in structure, even if devastating in implication. There had been no masked intruder, no religious extremist, no unknown enemy scaling fences before dawn. There had been a husband and father inside the home. Digital evidence, forensic timelines, financial records, and staged threats converged into one argument. The danger originated from within. The threatening emails, once framed as external hostility toward faith, were traced back to accounts he created, IP addresses linked to devices in his possession. The red writing messages on the walls, meant to imply ideological hatred, came from inside the garage. The gym alibi narrowed the time window rather than expanding it. The affair messages painted motive. Divorce meant public failure and financial burden. Life insurance meant liquidity and sympathy. Family annihilation cases often follow a chilling psychological path. Control over narrative is prioritized over preservation of life. Christopher did not snap in visible rage. He constructed an explanation before the crime. He reported threats weeks earlier. He laid groundwork. That planning became one of the most damaging elements of the prosecution's case. Jurors were shown messages in which he described wanting a different life, a life free from marital strain, a life without what he framed as emotional suffocation. Yet instead of leaving, he allegedly chose elimination. The verdict came in 2011, guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. There would be no future restart, no insurance-funded second chapter. The courtroom conclusion provided legal resolution, but legal resolution does not erase the image of two boys in their beds, of Garrett Coleman and Gavin Coleman losing their lives before adolescence was complete. Nor does it soften the image of Cherie Coleman strangled in her own bedroom. Late at night, when this story is told slowly, the most unsettling detail is not the red writing.
It is the ordinariness of the house. A suburban home in Columbia, Illinois. Neighbors mowing lawns, school buses arriving in the morning, a kitchen table where homework was once done. Family annihilation feels uniquely disturbing because it collapses the boundary between protector and predator. There is no forced entry, no broken glass, no external chaos, only a door closing behind the person who lives there. Christopher Coleman's case fits a broader pattern seen in similar crimes: financial pressure combined with emotional dissatisfaction, an extramarital relationship offering perceived escape, public image complicating separation, and the belief, however distorted, that eliminating family is a solution. But elimination is not escape, it is exposure. The staged hate crime narrative might have succeeded briefly if digital forensics had not traced the emails, but modern investigations leave fewer shadows: IP addresses, cell phone data, search histories, timestamps. Technology dismantled the fiction. The red writing meant to redirect suspicion became evidence of planning. In the years since, the Columbia subdivision has returned outwardly to routine. New residents move in, children ride bikes, mailboxes stand upright. But houses remember, not physically, but socially. Neighbors carry stories, communities absorb lessons. The Coleman case endures not because of spectacle, but because of deception layered over intimacy. a father who called 911, a staged threat invoking religion, a narrative designed to protect reputation, and beneath it, calculated violence. When the lights go out and houses settle into quiet, the story lingers for a reason. It reminds us that the most dangerous narratives are sometimes the ones built in advance, that staging often reveals more than chaos, and that proximity does not equal safety. Thank you for listening.